Hey, I'm Mac. Welcome back to my channel. In the late 2000s through the mid 2010s, we had this explosion of behavioral economics and pop psychology in the popular consciousness in the form of best-selling books and TED Talks where some professor of economics or tech bro or self-taught yoga instructor explains some studies they did and how the unexpected result is going to solve everything. It was basically like counterintuitiveness porn, as in the result is very attractively counterintuitive and it makes you feel like you're in the exclusive club that knows all the answers to all our problems. And a lot of it came from economists. See, economists have this tendency to exit their lanes into fields they have no understanding of and then make wildly overconfident, astonishingly shallow pronouncements. And then they don't cite any data or they misrepresent some paper that doesn't support their conclusion, but they'll just say that it did. And I guess they just don't think anyone will check, or it'll be a study they actually conducted where the results did not support their conclusion, but then they'll make some really complicated sounding explanation for why they should get to analyze the data in such a way that it ends up supporting their conclusion, even though in basically all real science fields, you can't just decide to do that. And the reason you can't just decide to do that is that it allows your biases to influence the results. Okay, the possibilities are truly endless. I don't know what it is about economists that makes them so prone to this behavior. What makes it so insufferable is the fact that they are perpetually so incredibly smug and patronizing and proclaim that numbers don't lie and how they're being objective while you're being subjective, because they don't understand that numbers have context. Numbers need to be analyzed and interpreted, and that context and interpretation matters a lot. Stephen Levitt, an economist at the University of Chicago, is certainly no exception to this, as stated by New York Times journalist Stephen Dubner in a 2003 article about Levitt, stating, quote, "Unlike most academics, Levitt is unafraid of using personal observations and curiosities, and he is also unafraid of anecdote and storytelling, apparently with zero interest in considering why most academics might be afraid of anecdotes and personal observations." It's not like the entire reason the scientific method was invented is because personal observations and anecdotes lead you to getting the wrong answer and looking stupid when you write an entire book of your asinine conclusions or anything. God. Dubner goes on, quote, "His particular gift is the ability to ask interesting questions. For instance, if drug dealers make so much money, why do they still live with their mothers? Which is more dangerous, a gun or a swimming pool? What really caused crime rates to plunge during the past decade? Do real estate agents have their clients' best interests at heart? Why do Black parents give their children names that may hurt their career prospects? Do school teachers cheat to meet high-stakes testing standards? Is sumo wrestling corrupt?" Personally, I think those are stupid questions with obvious answers, not interesting questions. I seriously doubt that most drug dealers live with their mothers, but putting that aside, I'm just going to assume this question results from Levitt and Dubner never having tried to rent an apartment with a felony on your criminal record and no legitimate job that issues a pay stub. It doesn't make sense to compare the danger levels of a gun in a swimming pool because those are not comparable objects. Crime dropped because of a complex web of many factors, because human society is complicated. Real estate agents have your interests at heart when they align with their own interests, just like anyone selling any service. Black parents name their children for the same reasons that white parents name their children, and acting like it's their fault people are racist is certainly an interesting choice. Some school teachers probably cheat, but not very many. And sumo wrestling probably has some corruption, just like all professional sports. All right. Bing, bang, boom. See how I didn't even have to write an entire book? Well, Levitt and Dubner don't see it that way. Instead, they blessed us in 2005 with their first book written together, Freakonomics, a rogue economist explores the hidden side of everything. A rogue economist. He is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. An economist at the University of Chicago calling themselves a rogue is like the Pope calling himself a rogue Catholic. Like, what are you talking about? You are the establishment. You don't get to be the establishment and be a rogue at the same time, bro. Okay? So I was in high school at this time, and while I never read it, one of my buddies on the track team, I remember he was reading it on the bus to this meet in North Carolina, and he said it was interesting or something. And while I would normally let it go for a book that was published 20 years ago, they've since published 10-year and 20-year anniversary editions with the text basically unaltered. So I guess they stand by their conclusions. So I, as a certified card-carrying hater, am going to tell you why this book is fucking terrible. Listen, love might make the world go round, but haters ensure that the world meets a minimum standard of quality while it does so. Let's go. I think that people sometimes have a tendency to not stop and consider if a story someone is telling them sounds like something that would actually happen, particularly when, one, the person telling them the story is speaking from a position of authority, like if they're a professor at the University of Chicago, and two, there are no immediate or obvious stakes associated with the story's truthfulness, right? Like, that's not something normal, well-adjusted, productive human beings do. I, however, as a man with over 30 years of experience in complaining about things that don't matter and getting mad about every bullshit thing that I see, am completely incapable of that level of peace and security. I don't know, man. I don't know. Okay. The book opens with this story, and this is the first 4 paragraphs. Okay.
Let's suppose you are the manager of a daycare center. You have a clearly stated policy that children are supposed to be picked up by 4 p.m., but very often parents are late. The result? At day's end, you have some anxious children and at least one teacher who must wait around for the parents to arrive. What to do? A pair of economists who heard of this dilemma, it turned out to be a rather common one, offered a solution: fine the late parents. Why, after all, should the daycare center take care of these kids for free?
What daycare center doesn't have a penalty for late pickups?
The economists decided to test their solution by conducting a study of 10 daycare centers in Haifa, Israel. The study lasted 20 weeks, but the fine was not introduced immediately. For the first 4 weeks, the economists simply kept track of the number of parents who came late. There were, on average, 8 late pickups per week per daycare center. In the 5th week, the fine was enacted. It was announced that any parent arriving more than 10 minutes late would pay $3 per child for each incident.
Okay. Maybe the reason that Levitt and Dubner think that this study makes sense is because they don't know how much daycare costs. $3 per child per incident with presumably no limit on how late you could be is an absolute bargain for childcare. That's not a fine. That's a giveaway. That is a gift. That is basically free.
After the fine was enacted, the number of late pickups promptly went up. Before long, there were 20 late pickups per week, more than double the original average. The incentive had plainly backfired.
What did you think would happen when you started basically giving away free, unlimited childcare?
So, what was wrong with the incentive at the Israeli daycare centers? You have probably already guessed that the $3 fine was simply too small. What if the fine had been set at $100 instead of $3? That would have likely put an end to the late pickups, though it would have also engendered plenty of ill will.
$100 is what most daycares would charge you if you picked up like 20 minutes late. And then they would disenroll your child if you did it more than a couple times. I mean, What are you going to do about it? Find another daycare? You're going to find another daycare? Yeah, exactly.
But there was another problem with the daycare center fine. It substituted an economic incentive, the $3 penalty, for a moral incentive, the guilt that parents were supposed to feel when they came late. So for just a few dollars each day, parents could buy off their guilt. Furthermore, the small size of the fine sent a signal to the parents that late pickups weren't such a big problem.
Yeah, no. This is such a stupid analysis. It has nothing to do with some moral thing subbing in here. There are two things going on here. Like, first, a fee of $3 is not enough money to be an actual consequence. Okay, the point of a fine like that is to make something that would only be the daycare's problem into the parent's problem. That's why you did not see a reduction in the number of late pickups. Second, by explicitly spelling out that the consequence of picking your child up more than 10 minutes late was $3, you've turned what was previously in the mind of the parents a cloud of unknown, unspecified consequences into a known consequence of definite size. It's not the fact that you transformed it from a moral to an economic thing. It's that you clarified what the consequences are. Before this, a parent running late would be like, maybe there's like $100 fee that I didn't see in the forms that we signed. Maybe they'll kick my child out of daycare altogether. Oh no, this is so bad. I better hurry. They are going to be so mad now that they know it will be exactly $3 if they're late. The end. Okay, like for those unaware, daycare can cost over $1,000 a month, and most daycares charge per minute for a late pickup, as in like $3 to $5 per minute, and also have a limit on how many times you can be late before they disenroll your kid. So the daycares in this study are charging the parents $3 if they pick their child up 10 minutes late, a time at which most daycares would have a fine of $30 to $50 and counting. Okay, so I'm like, I need to see this study. And I go to the back of the book to find the citation, since for some reason they can't just use footnotes. And it turns out that the students who conducted the study and wrote the paper actually concluded the same thing as me and did not reach the conclusion Levitt reached. They just used economics words or whatever, okay? But they still stated that the key issue was that prior to instituting the fine, there was an incomplete contract between the parents and the daycare, meaning the penalties for violating the contract were not specified, which allowed the parents to imagine potentially severe consequences that might exist. By instituting and spelling out the fine, it became a complete contract, and the parents, knowing that the worst possible outcome was a $3 fine, acted accordingly and continued to do so when the fine was removed, because the parents now knew that the consequences, if any, would have been explicitly spelled out because they were spelled out when the fine was there. Okay, look, the point is, at $5 per minute, picking up your child late from daycare is more expensive than phone sex, and maybe if you had just called a phone sex hotline, you wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. Okay, that is real Freakonomics, bitch. Boom. All right. Seriously, this might sound trivial, but these are completely different conclusions with very different outcomes. Like, if you attempted to apply the findings in practice, you get a different result. So the interpretation matters. These pop economics and pop science books sell millions of copies, and they get read by very influential politicians who will then shape their policy proposals and messaging around what they read. And there are a lot of very heavy, very high stakes topics to come. Nevertheless, this book is such a cluttered, hot mess express that they then spend 11 pages on potential corruption and sumo wrestling, which, I'm sorry, I don't care at all. followed by 12 pages on this story about a guy who was the head of a public research group at a federal government contractor. And in 1962, he started bringing bagels in with a basket to collect money or whatever. And the point is that he supposedly, one, went into this honor system bagel delivery business full time and started making more money than at his research job.
I went from being 2 banana plants up to a thrill-seeking shark who sold pictures of different toys I wanted.
And two, that 90% of people paid for the bagels and therefore people are honest. Listen, all I'm going to say is, one, I can't believe you wasted my time for 12 pages on that dumb story. And two, that story sounds extremely made up. I'm not saying it's not true, but I am rejecting the implied proposition that this story should inform my worldview. Okay, I'm also questioning the choice to spend the majority of your first chapter on sumo wrestling and this weird bagel story. Hopefully, the following chapters will have tighter logic and narrative. What could possibly go wrong? The second chapter is titled, How is the Ku Klux Klan like a group of real estate agents? So we're already off to a rough start. While this is a question I am certain that nobody on this earth not named Stephen Levitt has ever asked, they spend many pages attempting to answer it by describing how in the 1940s, two activists, Stetson Kennedy and John Brown, basically infiltrated the KKK and leaked all the secret code words and plans so they could be broadcast on various popular radio shows of the day, concluding,
As the Pearson and Superman radio shows played on, and as Stetson Kennedy continued to relay the Klan's secrets obtained by John Brown to other broadcast and print outlets, a funny thing happened. Attendance at Klan meetings began to fall, as did applications for new membership. Of all the ideas that Kennedy had thought up to fight bigotry, this campaign was easily the cleverest. He had turned the Klan's secrecy against itself by making its private information public. He converted heretofore precious knowledge into ammunition for mockery. Americans who might have been philosophically inclined to oppose the Klan had now been given enough specific information to oppose them more actively, and public sentiment began to shift. Americans who might have been philosophically inclined to embrace the Klan had now been given all sorts of caution against doing so.
Sure, Jan.
Are you out of your fucking mind? The idea that disseminating information was impactful on weakening the Klan is so naive and infantile that it would almost read as quaint optimism if it weren't for the context that it's coming from an economist. See, economists do this thing where they'll analyze some numbers and supposedly demonstrate that some long-standing, multifaceted, gargantuan societal problem can actually be solved with this one quick, easy, and cheap trick. So, therefore, we actually don't have to allocate any resources to solving that problem whatsoever.
Although the Klan would never quite die, especially down south, David Duke, a smooth-talking Klan leader from Louisiana, mounted substantive bids for the U.S. Senate and other offices. It was certainly handicapped, at least in the short term, by Stetson Kennedy's brazen dissemination of inside information. While it is impossible to tease out the exact impact that his work had on the Klan, many people have given Kennedy a great deal of credit for damaging an institution that was in grave need of being damaged.
Who are these many people? Who?
This did not come about because Stetson Kennedy was courageous, or resolute, or unflappable, even though he may have been all of these. It happened because he understood the raw power of information. The Ku Klux Klan, much like politicians, or real estate agents, or stockbrokers, was a group whose power was derived in large part from the fact that it hoarded information.
Imagine bringing up the KKK for 10 pages of your book apropos of nothing, and this is how you spend them. It's such a bizarre topic to bring up if you're going to have such a feeble treatment of it that essentially has the effect of trivializing the scale of the problem of white supremacist terrorism. Like, whether this is factually accurate or not, it's really strange. And it's kind of unbelievable that this chapter was republished in the 2025 edition, largely unchanged. I would not have predicted that. But okay, guess we're standing by the whole real estate agents and the KKK are similar then. What a point to go out of your way to make. Jesus. The last few pages of chapter 2 are spent describing this study conducted by 3 prominent figures in behavioral economics using a supposed data set from an online dating website. This is the description in Freakonomics.
2 economists and a psychologist recently banded together to address these questions. Ali Hortaxu, Gunther Hitch, and Don Ariely analyzed the data from one of the mainstream dating sites, focusing on roughly 30,000 users, half in Boston and half in San Diego.
Which trips the alarm on my skepticism circuitry. Like, wow, that's non-specific and causes me to have a lot of questions like, which dating site? How did you obtain the data? What data did they give? Were the users informed that their private information was being revealed for the purposes of conducting published research? Was this done by scraping the profiles, or was this done by a release from the dating site? If it was a release from the back end of the site, was it authorized? And why did the dating site agree to provide this data? Were they compensated for it? So again, I find the citation in the back of the book and retrieve the study using Sci-Hub because paying for academic papers is unhinged behavior. Use Sci-Hub, Elsevier can get fucked. And I scroll to where they describe obtaining the data. Dataset contains socioeconomic and demographic information and a detailed account of the website activities of more than 23,000 users of a major online dating service. 11,390 users were located in the Boston area, and 11,691 users were located in San Diego. We observed the users' activities over a period of 3.5 months in 2003. We first provide a brief description of online dating that also clarifies how the data were collected. It doesn't. Upon joining the dating service, the users answer questions from a mandatory survey and create profiles of themselves. I don't know what's with the scare quotes on the word profiles, but maybe it's because it was conducted in 2003 and the concept of a profile page was still kind of new to people. I don't know. Anyway, I have to mention that here they have a footnote clarifying neither the names or any contact information of the users were provided to us in order to protect the privacy of the users. A statement that is going to become very funny in a couple of minutes here. Such a profile is a web page that provides information about a user and can be viewed by other members of the dating service. The users indicate various demographic, socioeconomic, and physical characteristics, such as their age, gender, education level, height, weight, eye and hair color, and income. The users also answer a question on why they joined the service, for example, to find a partner for a long-term relationship, or alternatively, a partner for a casual relationship. In addition, the users provide information that relates to their personality, lifestyle, or views. For example, the site members indicate what they expect on a first date, whether they have children, their religion, whether they attend church frequently or not, and their political views. All this information is either numeric, such as age and weight, or an answer to a multiple choice question, and hence easily storable and usable for our statistical analysis. The users can also answer essay questions that provide more detailed information about their attitudes and personalities. This information is too unstructured to be usable for our analysis. Many users also include one or more photos in their profile. We have access to these photos, and, as we will explain in detail later, used the photos to construct a measure of the user's physical attractiveness. After registering, the users can browse, search, and interact with other members of the dating service. Typically, users start their search by indicating an age range and geographic location for their partners in a database query form. The query returns a list of short profiles indicating the username, age, and a brief description, and if available, a thumbnail version of the photo of a potential mate. By clicking on one of the short profiles, the searcher can view the full user profile, which contains socioeconomic and demographic information, a larger version of the profile photo, and possibly additional photos, and answers to several essay questions. Upon reviewing this detailed profile, the searcher decides whether to send an email, a first contact, to the user. Our data contains a detailed second-by-second account of all these user activities. We know if and when a user browses another user, views his or her photos, sends an email to another user, answers a received email, etc. We also have additional information that indicates whether an email contains a phone number, email address, or keyword or phrase such as "let's meet" based on an automated search for special words and characters in the exchanged emails. Okay, what the actual fuck? I'm kind of iffy on whether this is even real data because the third author on this paper, Dan Ariely, was caught red-handed publishing a study with completely fraudulent data that ironically was about honesty. I almost hope that this data is not real because it's somehow worse if it is real. Okay, I'm sure the dating website has it in their terms and conditions that they can do this. Companies like that unfortunately sell your detailed information all the time. Nevertheless, on the part of the researchers, whether the names or contact details were included or not is completely irrelevant when their photo, height, age, weight, and so on were included. I find it very hard to believe that the users consented to this information being used for academic research by a third party, and psychological research is supposed to be conducted with the consent of the subjects, particularly when it's a topic that is this sensitive, like sex and dating. Okay, I mean, it included their photos and their private messages. Photos that you had undergrads rate for their attractiveness, dude. And it included messages and all their browsing data, second by second. Are you serious? This was incredibly unethical. Was the dating site paid for this data? The paper never says, but there's no way the site would just give away that data for free. I have so many fucking questions. What on earth? Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I did not find the conclusions to be interesting. You can really tell that this book was rushed out. It's just constantly all over the place with the topics, and then it just kind of like forces some kind of supposed connection between them. You sort of don't realize it when you're reading it, but then when you finish it, you realize that there wasn't really an ultimate point to it. Scattered throughout this book are these odd passages that seem to either be some insecurity on the part of our authors about the book they've written or evidence of a complete and total absence of any ability on their part to engage in critical self-reflection. For example, chapter 3 opens with this almost painfully ironic passage.
The two previous chapters were built around a pair of admittedly freakish questions. What do school teachers and sumo wrestlers have in common? And how is the Ku Klux Klan like a group of real estate agents? But if you ask enough questions, strange as they may seem at the time, you may eventually learn something worthwhile. The first trick of asking questions is to determine if your question is a good one. Just because a question has never been asked does not mean it is good. Smart people have been asking questions for quite a few centuries now, so many of the questions that haven't been asked are bound to yield uninteresting answers.
Dun 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 dun. I couldn't agree more. They then assert that before Listerine's 1920s marketing campaign, nobody cared about bad breath, saying,
Listerine's new ads featured forlorn young women and men, eager for marriage, but turned off by their mate's rotten breath.
Can I be happy with him in spite of that? One maiden asked herself.
Until that time, bad breath was not conventionally considered such a catastrophe. But Listerine changed that.
I'm not kissing you if you have bad breath. So I applaud Listerine for bringing that to popular consciousness then. Okay, maybe marketing is capable of positive effects. The majority of Chapter 3 focuses on the research of a sociologist named Sudhir Venkatesh, and honestly, I can really only convey this by playing more selections of the audiobook, and some of these are going to get a little bit long because I just want you to hear this directly from the source. And like, trigger warning, this excerpt contains the N-word, which is another reason why I will not be reading it to you. Okay, here we go. You ready? You're not ready. You're not ready for fish jelly.
Sudhir Venkatesh. His boyhood friends called him Sid, but he has since reverted to Sudhir. Was born in India, raised in the suburbs of upstate New York and Southern California, and graduated from the University of California at San Diego with a degree in mathematics. In 1989, he began to pursue his PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago.
But his graduate advisor, the eminent poverty scholar William Julius Wilson, promptly sent Venkatesh into the field. His assignment? To visit Chicago's poorest black neighborhoods with a clipboard and a 70-question multiple-choice survey. This was the first question on the survey. How do you feel about being black and poor? A, very bad. B, bad. C, neither bad nor good. D, somewhat good. E, very good.
Let me just break in right here and question who the fuck in the sociology department at the University of Chicago wrote that question, and what the fuck were the rest of the questions? I feel like the author of Freakonomics intends for us to laugh here. And while it is funny, this is not like a comedy movie script. Okay, someone who presumably is a faculty member in the sociology department at the University of Chicago thought that was appropriate to ask Black people living in Chicago's roughest public housing projects. And they then approved sending a graduate student to the Robert Taylor homes, because that's the project we're referring to ask random people a question that anyone with even an elementary school level of social awareness would understand was likely to be extremely provocative to the residents of that project. Am I understanding this correctly?
One day, Venkatesh walked 20 blocks from the university to a housing project on the shore of Lake Michigan to administer his survey. The project comprised 3 16-story buildings made of yellow-gray brick. Venkatesh soon discovered that the names and addresses he had been given were badly outdated. These buildings were condemned, practically abandoned. Some families lived on the lower floors, pirating water and electricity, but the elevators didn't work. Neither did the lights in the stairwell. It was late afternoon in early winter, nearly dark outside. Venkatesh, who is a thoughtful, handsome, and well-built but not aberrationally brave person, had made his way up to the 6th floor, trying to find someone willing to take his survey. Suddenly, on the stairwell landing, he startled a group of teenagers shooting dice. They turned out to be a gang of junior-level crack dealers who operated out of the building, and they were not happy to see him. "I'm a student at the University of Chicago," Venkatesh sputtered, sticking to his survey script, "and I am administering—"
Fuck you, what are you doing in our stairwell? There was an ongoing gang war in Chicago. Things had been violent lately, with shootings nearly every day.
Right. The Robert Taylor homes were notorious for being the epicenter of it. So that's pretty interesting that a graduate student just happened to head there first for this survey, and that the sociology department and his eminent poverty scholar mentor were just totally fine with that. These projects ran for 2 miles. They were 16 stories and 28 buildings. In total, they had a peak population of 27,000 residents. And you're telling me that sometime after the 3 most infamous buildings in the most infamous housing project in Chicago were condemned in the early 1990s, someone, presumably the eminent poverty scholar mentoring Venkatesh, handed him a list of buildings to go to and did not notice that those buildings were still on there, even though they're extremely infamous. Okay.
This gang,
a branch of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, was plainly on edge. They didn't know what to make of Venkatesh. He didn't seem to be a member of a rival gang, but maybe he was some kind of spy? He certainly wasn't a cop. He wasn't black, wasn't white. He wasn't exactly threatening. He was armed only with his clipboard. But he didn't seem exactly harmless either.
I'm sorry, are you psychic?
Thanks to his 3 months trailing the Grateful Dead, he still looked, as he would later put it, like a genuine freak with hair down to my ass. The gang members started arguing over what should be done with Venkatesh. Let him go? But if he did tell the rival gang about this stairwell hangout, they'd be susceptible to a surprise attack. One jittery kid kept wagging something back and forth in his hands. In the dimming light, Venkatesh eventually realized it was a gun, and muttering, "Let me have him, let me have him." Venkatesh was very, very scared. The crowd grew, bigger and louder. Then an older gang member appeared. He snatched the clipboard from Venkatesh's hands and, when he saw that it was a written questionnaire, looked puzzled. "I can't read any of this shit," he said. "That's because you can't read," said one of the teenagers, and everyone laughed at the older gangster. He told Venkatesh to go ahead and ask him a question from the survey.
If you are wondering how he knew it was a questionnaire or had questions without being able to read, good question.
Venkatesh led with the "how does it feel to be black and poor" question. It was met with a round of guffaws, some angrier than others. As Venkatesh would later tell his university colleagues, he realized that the multiple choice answers A through E were insufficient.
You didn't realize until then?
In reality, he now knew, the answers should have looked like this. A, very bad. B, bad. C, neither bad nor good. D, somewhat good. E, very good. And F, fuck you. Just as things were looking their bleakest for Venkatesh, another man appeared. This was JT, the gang's leader. JT wanted to know what was going on. Then he told Venkatesh to read him the survey question. He listened, but then said he couldn't answer the question because he wasn't black. "Well then," Venkatesh said, "how does it feel to be African-American and poor?" "I ain't no African-American either, you idiot. I'm a JT then administered a lively, though not unfriendly taxonomical lesson in versus, quote, African-American versus, quote, black. When he was through, there was an awkward silence. Still, nobody seemed to know what to do with Venkatesh. JT, who was in his late 20s, had cooled down his subordinates, but he didn't seem to want to interfere directly with their catch. Darkness fell, and JT left. "People don't come out of here alive," the jittery teenager with the gun told Venkatesh. "You know that, don't you?" As night deepened, his captors eased up. They gave Venkatesh one of their beers, and then another and another. When he had to pee, he went where they went, on the stairwell landing 1 floor up. JT stopped by a few times during the night, but he didn't have much to say. Daybreak came, and then noon. Venkatesh would occasionally try to discuss his survey, but the young crack dealers just laughed and told him how stupid his questions were.
Okay, then the crack dealers are the only smart people in this story, okay? How stupid is this guy? You needed to go through this process to learn that? Are you serious? Why are such stupid people being admitted to graduate programs at the University of Chicago? I'm serious. Sudhir Venkatesh, if this is real, you're stupid. You're stupid. I'm sorry, but you're stupid.
Finally, nearly 24 hours after Venkatesh stumbled upon them, they set him free.
Hey, I'm sorry that I'm excerpting so much of this, but I kind of have to in order to make my point about it.
He went home and took a shower. He was relieved, but he was also curious. It struck Venkatesh that most people, including himself, had never given much thought to the daily life of ghetto criminals. He was now eager to learn how the black disciples worked, from top to bottom. After a few hours, he decided to walk back to the housing project. By now, he had thought of some better questions to ask. Having seen firsthand that the conventional method of data gathering was in this case absurd, Venkatesh vowed to scrap his questionnaire and embed himself with the gang.
Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out.
He tracked down JT and sketched out his proposal. JT thought Venkatesh was crazy, literally, a university student wanting to cozy up to a crack gang. But he also admired what Venkatesh was after. As it happened, JT was a college graduate himself, a business major. After college, he had taken a job in Chicago's Loop District, working in the marketing department of a company that sold office equipment. But he felt so out of place there, like a white man working at Afro Sheen headquarters, he liked to say, that he quit. Still, he never forgot what he learned. He knew the importance of collecting data and finding new markets. He was always on the lookout for better management strategies. It was no coincidence, in other words, that JT was the leader of this crack gang. He was bred to be a boss. After some wrangling, JT promised Venkatesh unfettered access to the gang's operations as long as JT retained veto power over any information that, if published, might prove harmful. For the next 6 years, Venkatesh practically lived there. Under JT's protection, he watched the gang members up close, at work and at home. He asked endless questions. Sometimes the gangsters were annoyed by his curiosity. More often, they took advantage of his willingness to listen. "It's a war out here, man," one dealer told him. "I mean, every day people struggling to survive, so, we just do what we can. We ain't got no choice, and if that means getting killed, well, shit, it's what to do around here to feed their family." Venkatesh would move from one family to the next, washing their dinner dishes and sleeping on the floor. He bought toys for their children. He once watched a woman use her baby's bib to sop up the blood of a teenage drug dealer who was shot to death in front of Venkatesh. Over the years, the gang endured bloody turf wars and, eventually, a federal indictment. A member named Booty, who was one rank beneath JT, came to Venkatesh with a story. Booty was being blamed by the rest of the gang for bringing about the indictment, he told Venkatesh, and therefore suspected that he would soon be killed. He was right. But first, Booty wanted to do a little atoning. For all the gang's talk about how crack dealing didn't do any harm, they even liked to brag that it kept black money in the black community, Booty was feeling guilty. He wanted to leave behind something that somehow might benefit the next generation. He handed Venkatesh a stack of well-worn spiral notebooks, blue and black, the gang's colors. They represented a complete record of 4 years' worth of the gang's financial transactions. At first, Venkatesh didn't even want the notebooks. What if the feds found out he had them? Perhaps he'd be indicted too. Besides, what was he supposed to do with the data? Despite his math background, he had long ago stopped thinking in numbers. Upon completing his graduate work at the University of Chicago, Venkatesh was awarded a 3-year stay at Harvard's Society of Fellows. Its environment of sharp thinking and bonhomie, the walnut paneling, the sherry cart once owned by Oliver Wendell Holmes, delighted Venkatesh.
And meanwhile, JT, who is the entire reason Mr. Venkatesh was awarded his fellowship, is in prison.
He went so far as to become the society's wine steward. And yet, he regularly left Cambridge, returning again and again to the crack gang in Chicago. This street-level research made Venkatesh something of an anomaly. Most of the other young fellows were dyed-in-the-tweed intellectuals who liked to pun in Greek. One of the society's aims was to bring together scholars from various fields who might not otherwise have occasion to meet. Venkatesh soon encountered another anomalous young fellow, one who also failed the society stereotype. This one happened to be an economist who, instead of thinking grand macro thoughts, favored his own list of offbeat micro curiosities. At the very top of his list was crime. And so, within 10 minutes of their meeting, Sudhir Venkatesh told Stephen Levitt about the spiral notebooks from Chicago, and they decided to collaborate on a paper. It would be the first time that such priceless financial data had fallen into an economist's hands, affording an unparalleled analysis of a heretofore
Uncharted criminal enterprise.
Listen, I hate to interrupt you two jerking each other off before you've had the chance to blow your load of self-congratulatory arrogance all over each other. But those of us out here in the real world are going to go ahead and discuss, okay? Like, I mean, we all see the problem here, right? Like, this story is so obviously either entirely made up or embellished and exaggerated beyond any useful standard of reliability. It's kind of unsettling that everyone at Harvard and the University of Chicago was just like, yeah, sounds legit. Give this guy a fellowship. Like, what? Oh my God. Venkatesh would publish this whole gang story in more detail in a 2008 book titled Gang Leader for a Day, where it is presented as being factual. The book contains suspiciously neat narrative arcs and character-driven events, multiple instances where Venkatesh apparently confesses to being an accessory to murder, and one incident where Venkatesh participates in a gang beating. Are you serious? Harvard and University of Chicago? Why the fuck was he not expelled and referred for indictment? He's just a gang member at this point. You're not doing research, bro, if this account is true. You participated in a gang beating. Are you fucking kidding me? The gang members who helped you with this project, including JT, who, according to your story, you manipulated into helping with your research project by lying to him and saying it was for a biography. Those guys go to prison while you, despite full participation in this criminal enterprise, up to and including a gang beating, are the wine steward at the Harvard Society of Fellows, enjoying its bonhomie, a word I had to look up, and sherry cart? Come the fuck on. Fuck you. Of course, that's assuming JT is real, okay? Most evidence points to him being a composite of several real people at best, or a completely fictional character at worst. It's basically impossible to tease apart how much of these accounts are true. Some academic sources cite the fact that the corporate-like structure of the gang he describes matches up with the structure revealed in a federal indictment, and frankly, I don't really see how you could expect the gang not to have a corporate structure. Like, the gang's activities and products are illegal, but they're still selling products, and doing that profitably and effectively basically requires organization. It's not like individually wrapped gram bags of cocaine and heroin just poof into the street level dealer's pockets. It has to come up from Mexico or Key West, which is going to happen in large shipments from cartels who aren't going to sell small quantities, which means you need a significant amount of capital to get your inventory to sell. And I'm sure you can already see how several people pooling their money to buy bricks from the cartel, and then they split that up to be sold by their guys, and so on and so forth, until you've basically got the equivalent of cashiers on the street, shift supervisors above them, managers by the block, district managers, regional managers, and a CEO/kingpin. I mean, the Black Disciples were reportedly moving over $16 million of product a year at the Robert Taylor homes, and that's in mid-1990s dollars, which would be around $30 to $50 million today. I mean, that's not really something you can do without being organized. Furthermore, it's very weird that the gang would have only one set of books, since a significant portion of the operation would be money laundering that would need to happen with the cash coming in, and none of that appears to be accounted for. So who even knows if any of that is real? And nobody can really prove whether it is or isn't. And once an academic celebrity like Stephen Levitt was involved, everyone apparently just stops verifying. After all, why launch an investigation into something if the result could damage the reputation of one of the star researchers at your school, right? Ugh. I mean, it's the only explanation for why Columbia University would be the next university to demand a taste of Venkatesh's little rubber donut by making him the director of the Center for Urban Research and Policy in 2009, although he would lose that position in 2011 when 6 years after the publication of Freakonomics, but 4 years before the publication of the 10th anniversary edition, and 14 years before the 20th anniversary edition, okay, neither of which mention the following event, okay? Several research projects he was working on were the subject of investigation. The investigation, among other things, identified cash payments of $100 each to research subjects who could not be identified, totaling $33,000. Cash payments for, quote, fabricated business purposes totaling $52,328 to a subject in one of his documentaries, $15,000 paid to a freelance editor who worked on Gang Leader for a day, even though only $5,000 was budgeted, a payment for $8,911 that was supposed to go to a colleague who collaborated on a research project that was never received by said colleague. Venkatesh then claimed that the colleague failed to complete the work. The auditors determined that that was not true. The work was completed. $19,000 in inappropriate transactions, $1,514 in town car charges, and $221,960 in expenses with insufficient documentation, such as payments to unspecified nameless research subjects. This is especially concerning given the fact that his research subjects are people in extremely economically vulnerable positions who would be very easy to manipulate with relatively small sums of money, likely willing to risk even their safety for what would be a trivial amount of cash to a researcher with a budget of millions of dollars. But don't worry about our baby boy, though, okay? As the investigation was ending, he was brought on as the academic director at the Berlin School of Creative Leadership before going on to work for the FBI. Yeah, that's right. What a fucking snitch. Those guys, if they were real, got you to where you were and you sold them out. I guess they're not real human beings to you, are they? You are absolute fucking trash, man. The fact that he went on to work for the FBI really changes the wallpaper of how I perceive his character. He paints himself as this clueless, helpless graduate student whom JT took under his wing, but this revelation makes him seem a hell of a lot more exploitative and sinister. He also went on to write another book titled Floating City, allegedly about sex workers in New York City while conducting research at Columbia. I say allegedly because reviews for this book have been far more critical, with Greg Barnheisel of the Los Angeles Review of Books writing, to put it frankly, it's hard to take the soudir of Floating City, and the obvious disingenuousness of the self-portrait in Floating City even makes gang leader Soudir look more problematic in retrospect. It all seems like a very untrustworthy source, with how much of his published work is known to be dramatized, fictionalized, and altered to prioritize narrative over accuracy, not to mention the $250,000 in unexplained research expenses. It makes you wonder if that's everything shady he's done, or if that's just everything that has been made public. Not that it matters, because, oh my god, he collaborated with Stephen Levitt and had a little cameo in Freakonomics, you guys. That means everything he does and says is reliable, right? Yeah, but anyway, sociology and economics are totally real science, you guys, just like chemistry and pharmacology, okay? Where you don't write down any precise results or any dates or times or numbers, and you just kind of make up a narrative and get your research subjects to participate by lying to them about what you're doing, because that's cool. That's rogue, okay? That's awesome. It's like rebels, you know? All I'm gonna say is that across many fields, but particularly this type of behavioral economics, those in academia seem completely unfazed by the torrent of garbage research and misconduct being pumped out. And if they can't figure out some way to put a stop to it, there will come a day when their credibility is fully exhausted and no published research is taken seriously anymore. I'm just saying. Okay, guys, I swear I didn't mean for this video about this stupid book to be so long. I really thought I was going to be done with this script so long ago, and yet, like, here we are. Like, you think we're far along, don't you? But we haven't even gotten to the section that was the reason I wanted to make a video, you guys. We haven't even gotten to the main course. Like, Stephen Levitt ruined my life, okay? Okay, calm down, okay. So, chapter 4 contains the claim that this book is most well known for, and its biggest cause of controversy. It begins by telling us about Romania under the brutal dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, who, in an attempt to raise the birth rate, completely banned abortion in 1967, leading to a brief baby boom. Levitt explains,
Ceausescu's incentives produced the desired effect. Within 1 year of the abortion ban, the Romanian birth rate had doubled. These babies were born into a country where, unless you belonged to the Ceausescu clan or the communist elite, life was miserable. But these children would turn out to have particularly miserable lives. Compared to Romanian children born just 1 year earlier, the cohort of children born after the abortion ban would do worse in every measurable way. They would test lower in school, they would have less success in the labor market, and they would also prove much more likely to become criminals.
Ceausescu would rule until 1989, when police fired into crowds of thousands of protesters in Timisoara, spurring hundreds of thousands to turn out in Bucharest several days later in protests that would quickly become violent, which means they became effective, just saying. And the former dictator and his wife were executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. Levitt says,
Of all the communist leaders deposed in the years bracketing the collapse of the Soviet Union, only Nicolae Ceausescu met a violent death. It should not be overlooked that his demise was precipitated in large measure by the youth of Romania, a great number of whom, were it not for his abortion ban, would never have been born at all.
That's a remarkably satisfying narrative and character arc. How suspicious. So I go to the back of the book once again to find the source because apparently I never learned my lesson and will never be able to stop writing this fucking script. What's interesting about this is actually what he reports the findings as being in Freakonomics is not what the findings were at all. Well, are kind of contrived here. Take a look at this. We've got them doing this sample restriction for one thing, where they're restricting the sample to people who live with both parents. Okay, so what they're calling the controls is the people who were born before the abortion ban went into effect, but still in 1967. And the treatments are the people who were born after it went into effect. So that would be like the second half of 1967. But they're also doing this restricted sample thing, which restricts them to to people who live with both parents, which is weird. That's a weird thing to restrict it to. I don't know why you would do that. They're saying that it's because they want to be able to look into the backgrounds of the parents, and they can only look into the backgrounds of the parents if they restrict the sample to people who still live with their parents, because that's the only place where you can get the census data like that. But for one thing, it seems like this significantly impacts the results, because what you will actually see here is that people born after the ban were more likely to finish high school, were more likely to graduate from university, were less likely to be in a low-skilled job, were more likely to have an intermediate skill job, were more likely to have a job with high skills. Which is like, that's the complete opposite of what Levitt says in Freakonomics. That is the exact opposite of what he said the findings were. And it's all statistically significant. They were statistically significantly more likely to finish high school, to finish university, and to have a high-skilled job. I don't understand. But then when they do this restricted sample where they are only looking at people who still live with their parents, yeah, that certainly looks a lot more like the story they're trying to tell. But you can't do that. You can't just decide that you want to restrict your sample because it tells the story that you want to tell. You cannot do that. That's bullshit. You are basically choosing to restrict this sample, in my opinion, because it is conducive to your narrative, and you can't do that. And furthermore, when you go into this results section, they explain the pattern of educational and labor market achievement is consistent with the view that children born after the restrictive policy change came into effect have better outcomes. They are more likely to have finished high school and university, and they are less likely to work in a job requiring only elementary skills and more likely to work in a job requiring high skills. So it doesn't matter how apparently surprising you find it. That's your findings. But then they go on to do this, to do these sample restrictions to control for. They not only do they do the sample restrictions to people who still live with their parents, but they also then decide that they're going to do a restriction that factors in their parents' background. I mean, clearly, an additional child that wasn't planned is going to be a bigger, or at least more likely to cause a hardship for a family that is poor than for a family that is middle class and like, they didn't want another kid, but they can still afford another kid. It wasn't their plan, but the family's going to be okay, for a middle class family or an upper class family. They weren't planning on having another kid, but they can afford it just fine. Whereas for a poor family, that could be like an incredibly huge hardship. We already know that. That's not what this study should be about. The study is supposed to be finding the effect of an abortion ban, but that's not what you're finding because you're deliberately you're adding all these little things to your analysis to exclude the things that aren't supporting what you already want the answer to be. And so I guess you just have to decide, do you want to find out what's true or do you want to be told that you're right? These are different things. You can't just do unjustified statistical shenanigans like this because that's not going to lead you to the truth. That's not the scientific process. Would you want to see a pharmaceutical company doing this type of shit? No, because you can't do that because that's not going to tell you what is real. It really pisses me off. So not only does the study misrepresent itself, and let me tell you, I think I have a good suspicion for why it misrepresents itself. Oh, would you look at that? Would you look at that? Christian Pope Elches received helpful comments from Steve Levitt on this study. And I highly, I would not be surprised to find out if those helpful comments were like about how to make it comport with his presupposed assumptions. So all of this is just, you cannot trust like one person and one source like this. And it really calls into question, they're calling the economics a science. This is not scientific. This is not science. This is not investigating the impact of an abortion ban on socioeconomic outcomes of children. That's not what this study is finding. If you wanted to find out what the impact of an abortion ban on socioeconomic outcomes of children, you would have just looked at the full sample because that would tell you. That would at least tell you the effect of an abortion ban on the socioeconomic outcomes. And that would tell you that whether you are, for it or against it, that would tell you what that impact is. Now, whether that impact is persuasive or not on whether, abortion should be allowed or not. Personally, I'm pro-choice. Even though this abortion ban made the socioeconomic outcomes better for the population, I don't care. I don't find that a persuasive reason to have an abortion ban. I think that women should still be allowed to choose. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to go try to manipulate these findings to make it look like it supports my beliefs. Because my political beliefs might be informed by data. They might be shaped by data. But ultimately, there's going to be morality involved. There's going to be other people's personal freedoms involved and what my beliefs about that are. So I really hate this because not only do they misrepresent the findings in this paper, Levitt is just plainly misrepresenting the findings in the book because he doesn't even mention that, the initial findings, when we actually just looked at the population before we did all these shenanigans, found the exact opposite of what I'm telling you. That's not in there anywhere. So what's the deal? So we're hurtling toward the thesis of this chapter, and I'm already displeased because of the incredibly suspicious claims being made, given how egregiously they misrepresented that study. Levitt and Dubner go on.
On that day, crime was just about at its peak in the United States. In the previous 15 years, violent crime had risen 80%. It was crime that led the nightly news and the national conversation. When the crime rate began falling in the early 1990s, it did so with such speed and suddenness that it surprised everyone. It took some experts many years to even recognize that crime was falling, so confident had they been of its continuing rise. Long after crime had peaked, in fact, some of them continued to predict ever darker scenarios. But the evidence was irrefutable. The long and brutal spike in crime was moving in the opposite direction, and it wouldn't stop until the crime rate had fallen back to the levels of 40 years earlier.
According to Levitt, the most commonly cited explanations for this drop in crime are, in order of most frequently cited to least, are innovative policing strategies, increased reliance on prisons, changes in crack and other drug markets, aging of the population, tougher gun control laws, strong economy, increased number of police, and all other explanations. Setting up the reveal of the chapter, they somewhat haughtily and snidely explain,
If you are the sort of person who likes guessing games, you may wish to spend the next few moments pondering which of these explanations seem to have merit and which don't. Hint: of the 7 major explanations on the list, only 3 can be shown to have contributed to the drop in crime. The others are, for the most part, figments of someone's imagination, self-interest, or wishful thinking. Further hint: one of the greatest measurable causes of the crime drop does not appear on the list at all, for it didn't receive a single newspaper mention.
They proceed to go through each of these hypotheses, starting off with the strong economy hypothesis, which states that the drop in crime we saw in the 1990s was due to strong economic growth and a large drop in unemployment that occurred at the same time. Levitt disagrees. Take a listen to his reasoning.
But a closer look at the data destroys this theory. It is true that a stronger job market may make certain crimes relatively less attractive, but that is only the case for crimes with a direct financial motivation, burglary, robbery, and auto theft, as opposed to violent crimes like homicide, assault, and rape.
I'm sorry, what? I've never heard someone make this claim before. It's honestly kind of surprisingly infantile to say that high unemployment would only increase crimes with a financial motive. For one, violent crime frequently is financially motivated, and you'd think that of all people, an author who just dedicated an entire chapter to the economic workings of a crack cocaine criminal enterprise would realize that.
Moreover, studies have shown that an unemployment decline of 1 percentage point accounts for a 1% drop in nonviolent crime. During the 1990s, the unemployment rate fell by 2 percentage points. Nonviolent crime, meanwhile, fell by 40%.
I don't understand the point he's making here. To me, that would suggest that perhaps the prior data is flawed, since it is not reflective of what we're actually observing, or that there are other factors at play.
But an even bigger flaw in the strong economy theory concerns violent crime. Homicide fell at a greater rate during the 1990s than any other sort of crime, and a number of reliable studies have shown virtually no link between the economy and violent crime. This weak link is made even weaker by glancing back to a recent decade, the 1960s, when the economy went on a wild growth spurt, and so did violent crime.
Okay, all of this sounded absolutely absurd to me, so once again I headed to the back of the book to find the sources, and
Nothing.
apparently studies have shown these one-to-one links between unemployment and nonviolent crime, but Levitt does not care to cite any of them for us, nor does he care to cite any of the number of reliable studies that have shown there to be no link between the economy and violent crime. Generally, violent crime is most closely associated with like long-term or permanent unemployment, so it doesn't always track with short-term labor market fluctuations, but it is still related, or at least we all thought it was until Levitt assured us that some unnamed mystery studies definitely say it has no link whatsoever. Okay. Speaking of permanent unemployment, the next hypothesis that comes up to bat is mass incarceration and increasing prison sentences. Levitt loves mass incarceration, which is predictable from an economist. They always claim to be data-driven, but they're only data-driven when the data supports their neoliberal, broadly conservative, covertly racist positions. The whole, socially liberal, fiscally conservative thing, which is just a longer way to say conservative. Look, there are very few issues that you can solve without allocating significant amounts of resources to them, and that's just the reality of the world that we live in. Anyway, here's what Levitt says.
During the first half of the 20th century, the incidence of violent crime in the United States was, for the most part, fairly steady. But in the early 1960s, it began to climb. In retrospect, it's clear that one of the major factors pushing this trend was a more lenient justice system. Conviction rates declined during the 1960s, and criminals who were convicted served shorter sentences. This trend was driven in part by an expansion in the rights of people accused of crimes, a long overdue expansion, some would argue. Others would argue that the expansion went too far. At the same time, politicians were growing increasingly softer on crime, quote, for fear of sounding racist, as the economist Gary Becker has written, quote, since African Americans and Hispanics commit a disproportionate share of felonies. So, if you were the kind of person who might want to commit a crime, the incentives were lining up in your favor. A slimmer likelihood of being convicted, and, if convicted, a shorter prison term. Because criminals respond to incentives as readily as anyone, the result was a surge in crime.
Levitt does not cite any sources for these claims, probably because they don't exist. And the idea that the fear of sounding racist would actually make politicians advocate for being softer on crime is absolutely ridiculous. You're talking about the United States in the 1960s and 70s. Are you out of your mind? Basically, the entire Republican strategy since 1964 has been to do as much dog whistling as possible, just in case voters are worried that you might not be racist. That's the entire purpose of the talking points like crime in the streets or welfare fraud or affirmative action. They're not actual problems, they're dog whistles, okay? The consensus Levitt describes actually doesn't exist, and a literature analysis by Michael Tonry, professor of law at the University of Minnesota, on the introduction of sentencing minimums, found the following. The evaluators of the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, which required lengthy prison sentences for drug offenses, were tasked with finding the effects it had on drug use and drug-related crime. No effects were observed. 3 studies evaluating the introduction of a 1-year minimum prison sentence in Massachusetts for possession of an unregistered firearm found it to have no deterrent effect on the use of firearms in violent crime, while one study found a very small short-term effect that disappeared over time. Evaluation of minimum sentencing laws in Michigan, Florida, and Pennsylvania all found no preventative effect on crime. The Legislative Analyst's Office of California found that the 3 strikes law's effect on crime was an open question. Out of 20 published assessments, 12 found there was no effect. 1 found that it led to increases in killing of police officers. 3 found that it led to an increase in homicide rates. 3 found very small decreases that the authors hedged as not worth the increased prison budget. This leaves 1 study out of 20 that reported a decrease in crime. However, Tonry notes that the author of that study is an economist and says, quote, like most economists, assumed that increased penalties reduce crime, which led to bias, cherry picking, and abuse of uncertainty. Yet, Levitt says,
The evidence linking increased punishment with lower crime rates is very strong. Harsh prison terms have been shown to act as both a deterrent for the would-be criminal on the street and a prophylactic for the would-be criminal who's already locked up. Logical as this may sound, some criminologists have fought the logic.
Bro, it is not that strong. You are just being stubborn and refusing to acknowledge that the data does not support your conclusions. That's why you don't have any citations in the back of the book for these claims, because there's nothing. Nobody agrees with you or the rest of your ilk, to the degree that academic analyses are being footnoted with basically, oh, ignore this one. It's an economist who doesn't understand confirmation bias again. The fact of the matter is, most violent crime is not premeditated. It happens in the heat of the moment, and a disproportionate amount is committed by young men. And if you ask me to think of a demographic group that is good at accurately and carefully weighing the risks versus benefits of an action, young men are pretty much going to be like at the bottom of that list.
Imprisonment is certainly one of the key answers. It accounts for roughly 1/3 of the drop in crime.
No further clarification on how exactly he arrived at that number and no further sources, so I'm going to attribute it directly to Levitt's colon. He dismisses that innovative policing strategies could possibly have reduced crime based on the fact that, quote, Los Angeles, a city notorious for bad policing, experienced the same crime drop as New York City did, which, whatever. Honestly, I don't care enough to unpack this one. We have to keep moving, okay? But I just want you to see what kind of supposedly data-driven analysis we're dealing with here. He then says that 10% of the crime drop was due to increased police hiring based on the New York City numbers, which, okay, I mean, I would point out that Washington, D.C.'s police force shrank by over 1,000 officers, and they still had a drop in violent crime almost as large as New York City's. But whatever, he's claiming 10%. Let's just let him have this one, okay? But next up is bursting of the crack bubble. He attributes 15% of the drop to this, and I don't really have any disagreement on that one. Whatever, that mostly makes sense. There was a large spike in homicides with crack cocaine's arrival on the scene, and then as it got cheaper, it stopped fueling so many gang violence incidents. The penultimate factor up for their consideration is the aging of the population. Levitt dismisses this outright as a potential factor, stating that
demographic change is too slow and subtle a process. You don't graduate from teenage hoodlum to senior citizen in just a few years to even begin to explain the suddenness of the crime decline.
That's an absolutely crazy thing to say, in my opinion. We know that young men commit a disproportionate amount of violent crime, and while individual people might age gradually, the overall population characteristics can dramatically change very quickly. Between 1980 and 1988, the overall population increased by 8.2%, but the population ages 18 to 24 decreased by 11.4%, and the population 14 to 17 decreased by 13.4%. Meanwhile, the population that was 35 to 44 increased 36.6%. It's a somewhat surprising conclusion to assert that a change that dramatic would not at least have some effect. We now arrive at the piece de résistance of this book, Levitt's pride and joy, his favorite hypothesis that abortion is the largest factor explaining the drop in crime observed in the 1990s. Remember legal abortion? Remember that?
Before Roe v. Wade, it was predominantly the daughters of middle or upper-class families who could arrange and afford a safe illegal abortion. Now, instead of an illegal procedure that might cost $500, any woman could easily obtain an abortion, often for less than $100.
Still really expensive.
What sort of woman was most likely to take advantage of Roe v. Wade? Very often she was unmarried or in her teens or poor, and sometimes all three. What sort of future might her child have had? One study has shown that the typical child who went unborn in the earliest years of legalized abortion would have been 50% more likely than average to live in poverty. He would have also been 60% more likely to grow up with just one parent. These two factors, childhood poverty and a single-parent household, are among the strongest predictors that a child will have a criminal future. Growing up in a single-parent home roughly doubles a child's propensity to commit crime. So does having a teenage mother. Another study has shown that low maternal education is the single most powerful factor leading to criminality. In other words, the very factors that drove millions of American women to have an abortion also seem to predict that their children, had they been born, would have led unhappy and possibly criminal lives.
Okay, first of all, some of those single-parent households are single-parent because completely disproportionate drug sentencing put the dad in prison for 25 years. Second of all, if you're thinking, wow, that sounds kind of eugenics-esque, you're not completely wrong. See, this is actually not the first time Levitt has put forward this hypothesis. It was previously put forward in a paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in May 2001, co-authored with John J. Donahue III, where they clearly hadn't workshopped a more palatable version of the verbiage just yet. Quote, fertility declines for Black women are 3 times greater than for whites, 12% compared with 4%. Given that homicide rates of Black youths are roughly 9 times higher than those of white youths, racial differences in the fertility effects of abortion are likely to translate into greater homicide reductions. Under the assumption that those Black and white births eliminated by legalized abortion would have experienced the average criminal propensities of their respective races, then the predicted reduction in homicide is 8.9%. Jesus, the average criminal propensities of their respective races. Wow. This paper contains a lot of red flags that suggest significant biased manipulation of the data. One footnote reads, "A full description of the assumptions and calculations is available from the authors on request." I find it very suspicious that they didn't simply print the assumptions and calculations in an appendix or within the body of the study. Another footnote reads, "It is worth noting one ostensible inconsistency between our predictions and the disaggregated time series data. There was a sharp spike in youth homicide rates in the early 1980s and early 1990s, especially among African Americans. These cohorts were born after legalized abortion. Importantly, this finding is not inconsistent with the central claim that abortion legalization contributed to lower crime rates, but merely shows the dampening effect on crime can be outweighed in the short term by factors that stimulate crime. Elevated youth homicide rates in this period appear to be clearly linked to the rise of crack and the easy availability of guns." This is the central problem with the way that they're approaching their research. When a confounding variable slaps them in the face, like the crack cocaine epidemic, they acknowledge that it could be overpowering their hypothesis. But that's always true, that there could be confounding variables. That's why you have to try to disprove your hypothesis. When you're dealing with a complex topic like this, there are so many ways you could be intentionally or unintentionally allowing your own confirmation bias to influence the result. You can't just find a correlation and stop investigating. There could be a variable that is influencing both abortion and crime, for example. So here's the problem with the whole proposition, all right? I have pulled the homicide rate data from the FBI, and you know what? I don't know why they say that you can't get data broken down by the age of the offender. You can. I found it. You can get it from the FBI. And so the age of the offender breaks out these categories. And then I've also plotted this blue line here that has the X's on it. That's abortion rate per 1,000 population. And then we also have the homicide rates by the age of the offender in per 100,000. And then I've added here these dashed lines, which show the year that you would expect to start seeing an effect of abortion on the data for each age bracket. So you would expect to see that around 1987 for the 14 to 17 category. And then you would expect to start seeing 18 to 24 category being affected around 1990, 1991. And then for the 25 to 34 category, you would expect that to be affected in 1988. And I am not seeing it, because you would expect to start seeing the 14 to 17 category going down here, but it's not going down. It goes up. And you'd expect to start seeing the 18 to 24 category going down here, but it's not. It's staying about the same, or it's going up. And I would also point out that even at the end of this data set, it is still higher than it was around 1984. And that, they still had abortion then. So I don't know. And then for the 25 to 34 category, that started going down at the beginning of this data set. It was already going down at the beginning of what we have data for. 35 to 49 category is going down for basically the entire duration of this data set. Same for the 50 and older. And that could not possibly have been affected by abortion. So I'm not seeing a very convincing trend for this, because these lines are going the opposite of how you would expect them to go. And you have these three age group categories, all of them are decreasing, and they cannot possibly have been affected by abortion. So what is the explanation for this? And why is that explanation not sufficient to account for these decreases? I am not convinced. Also worth noting that Canada experienced similar drops in crime, despite abortion not being decriminalized in Canada until 1988. Okay, social issues like this are really complicated, and it's nearly impossible to boil them down to just a few factors. We always want to have a simple explanation, a cause that we can point to. But with this type of thing, that's just not going to happen. And that doesn't mean that you can just invent one, no matter how satisfying that would be. In fact, Levitt obliviously says as much in this same chapter.
It may be more comforting to believe what the newspapers say, that the drop in crime was due to brilliant policing and clever gun control and a surging economy. We have evolved with a tendency to link causality to things we can touch or feel, not to some distant or difficult phenomenon. We believe especially in near-term causes. A snake bites your friend. He screams with pain and he dies. The snake bite, you conclude, must have killed him. Most of the time, such a reckoning is correct.
Okay, I would just point out here that the cause and effect involved in a snake bite is much simpler than the cause and effect involved in a broad societal trend. And furthermore, in the situation of the snake bite, part of why that is such a reasonable conclusion is because we already know that snake bites kill people. This isn't analogous to a snake bite. This is like if your friend got bitten by a snake and then 18 years later they die unexpectedly. And you're like, well, they did get bitten by a snake, so it's definitely 25% snake bite, 25% the heart attack he was in the middle of as he died, and 50% bad vibes. It's totally possible that the snakebite could have caused tissue damage that made the heart attack more likely, but you're vastly oversimplifying the situation and not questioning your own hypothesis.
But when it comes to cause and effect, there is often a trap in such open and shut thinking. We smirk now when we think of ancient cultures that embraced faulty causes. The warriors who believed, for instance, that it was their raping of a virgin that brought them victory on the battlefield. But we too embrace faulty causes, usually at the urging of an expert proclaiming a truth in which he has a vested interest.
Exactly. For example, a rogue economist who would make a huge splash if he put forth a completely new theory about a widely discussed crime drop with supporting evidence, like perhaps that abortion caused it. Wouldn't that be so nice to have that be true? It's controversial. It's taboo. It's a hot button issue. The media coverage, the academic recognition, the admiration of his peers, the dashing rogue rebel persona, the book deals. Sounds like a vested interest to me. Sounds like incentives. At the end of the day, what is far more likely is that crime dropped due to a vast number of interrelated factors that may or may not include abortion, that could even be different across different regions despite producing the same trend. I mean, how about the fact that the 1990s was when it started to become truly impossible to just skip town and start anew because of states sharing records electronically instead of having to mail or fax everything? It started to become possible for government agencies and police to quickly pull up a rap sheet from fingerprints or an ID by entering it into a computer database. Security cameras started recording everything in usable quality to VHS tape. The first ever use of DNA analysis for forensics was in 1985 in the United Kingdom. And at that time, it was very time consuming and it required a lot of cells to be present at the crime scene. But then in 1991, the first forensic technique making use of polymerase chain reaction was developed, and it was made commercially available in 1993. And that made DNA analysis much faster and much easier, and it could be used on extremely small samples. This was very much in the popular consciousness throughout the 1990s and early 2000s as the DNA analysis technology kept getting better and faster. And it really seemed like magic to people. And I could see that deterring a would-be rapist or murderer much more than a 25-year sentence instead of a 10-year sentence. It doesn't matter how long the potential sentence will be if you don't think you're going to get caught. See how complicated this is? To be so confident about abortion being the primary driver is ridiculous. And the problem with doing so is that very powerful people read books like this. And then they make policy decisions that are colored by the information in these books. Chapter 5 is all about parenting and why your way of parenting is illogical and dumb and stupid, you stupid, dumb, stupid brain. And Levitt's data-driven way of parenting is smart, logical, and scientifically sound.
My first question is, who the hell do you think you are telling me how to raise my kids?
For example,
Consider the parents of an 8-year-old girl named, say, Molly. Her two best friends, Amy and Imani, each live nearby. Molly's parents know that Amy's parents keep a gun in their house, so they have forbidden Molly to play there. Instead, Molly spends a lot of time at Imani's house, which has a swimming pool in the backyard. Molly's parents feel good about having made such a smart choice to protect their daughter. But according to the data, their choice isn't smart at all. In a given year, there's one drowning of a child for every 11,000 residential pools in the United States. In a country with 6 million pools, this means that roughly 550 children under the age of 10 drown each year. Meanwhile, there's one child killed by a gun for every 1 million plus guns. In a country with an estimated 200 million guns, this means that roughly 175 children under 10 die each year from guns. The likelihood of death by swimming pool, 1 in 11,000, versus death by gun, 1 in 1 million plus, isn't even close. Molly is roughly 100 times more likely to die in a swimming accident at Imani's house than in gunplay at Amy's.
That's great advice from someone who's never met my kids.
Or mine. And Rebecca, just by looking at your smug face, I can tell you have some more advice for our viewers who I'm sure couldn't have raised their kids if you hadn't deigned to talk to us today.
That's right, Tracy.
there are so many problems with this, and I'll start with one that really highlights Levitt's poor grasp of knowing what statistical measure is appropriate for a given real-world situation. It's similar to how he failed to use per capita measures of crime in the previous chapter. It verges on nonsensical to use deaths per gun and deaths per swimming pool for this. First of all, it's just really weird to use swimming pools and not children as the denominator. Second of all, just about every household that has a swimming pool only has one swimming pool, whereas most households that have one gun have more than just one. So a per gun stat is understating the risk associated with a gun-owning household. Levitt also fails to take into consideration any further details about the stats he's citing, which could change the interpretation and the takeaways from it. For example, 70% of drownings in residential pools occur when the child did not intend to be in the pool, like it was outside of swim time, as in they fell in. And 67% of swimming pool drownings are children under 3. Twice as many male children drown as female. So those are some pretty important qualifiers. The statement, Molly is far more likely to die in a swimming accident at Imani's house, is not accurate because most drownings are not swimming accidents. Most children who drown are under 3 years old, and most of them are boys. So we also haven't accounted for whether or not Molly can swim, which reduces drowning risk by 88%. Like, does this matter? Like, yeah, it does. Because saying Molly is most at risk of a swimming accident is different from saying she's most at risk of falling into the pool. It also ignores the fact that swimming can be a really beneficial social and physical activity, which is why many parents are fully aware of the dangers of swimming pools, but they still weigh those risks against the benefits of their children getting to have fun with their friends in the pool, and they evaluate that risk as being acceptable. I don't think most parents think guns are as enriching as pools. You know, you can't keep your children 100% safe, but you can evaluate the risks and benefits relatively. You know, there's also the elephant in the room, which is the risk to children over the age of 10 when there's a gun in the house, both accidental and, more importantly, intentional. And I think it's a bit careless to not mention it. My high school class wasn't that large, and we lost several students who shot themselves. So in terms of deaths per 100,000 population, which is an actually sensible metric when we're talking about death, if you have a son who is 10 to 14 years old, he's more likely to intentionally kill himself with a firearm than to accidentally drown. And if he's 15 to 19 years old, he's over 3 times more likely to intentionally kill himself with a firearm than to accidentally drown. And that risk is double the risk of him accidentally drowning back when he was a toddler. And it's over 7 times the risk of a girl of the same age doing the same thing. Nobody expects their son to kill himself. Does your son have access to your guns? Moving on to something a little more light. The final piece of trash being passed off as a chapter thrown into this dumpster fire of a book is the wonderfully titled Chapter 6. Would a Rashonda by any other name smell as sweet? Stephen, leave Rashonda alone and stop trying to smell her. This chapter includes several examples of Levitt mistaking racist jokes for actual data, and no, I'm not exaggerating, such as...
The judge, W. Dennis Duggan, had long taken note of the strange names borne by some offenders. One teenage boy, Amcher, had been named for the first thing his parents saw upon reaching the hospital, the sign for Albany Medical Center Hospital Emergency Room, Amcher.
Yeah, that happened. And
Roland G. Fryer Jr., while discussing his name's research on a radio show, took a call from a black woman who was upset with the name just given to her baby niece. It was pronounced Shatid, but was in fact spelled shithead.
Jesus Christ. That was a fucking prank call, dumbass. How is that not obvious to you? Actually, there's an asterisk on that statement, and the corresponding note in the back of the book reads, quote, the woman who called the radio show to tell Roland Fryer about her niece, Shatid, might have been misinformed, of course, or even outright lying. Regardless, she was hardly alone in her feeling that black names sometimes go too far. Unquote. Dude, that is a well-known racist joke. She was not misinformed or lying. It was a prank caller telling a racist joke on the radio. My God, man. I don't know how you don't find it utterly humiliating that you mistook a racist joke for actual data and printed it here like as an example, even 20 years later for a revised edition. This is why you should listen to your critics instead of doubling down, but you're too arrogant to do that. So I think you can see where this chapter is going. It's the same old, tired, racist discussion of quote unquote black names as always, but I want to share with you my favorite part. It's beautiful. Are you ready? You're not ready. You are not ready for fish jelly, okay?
So, how does it matter if you have a very white name or a very black name? Over the years, a series of audit studies have tried to measure how people perceive different names. In a typical audit study, a researcher would send 2 identical and fake resumes, one with a traditionally white name and the other with an immigrant or minority-sounding name, to potential employers. The white resumes have always gleaned more job interviews. According to such a study, if Deshaun Williams and Jake Williams sent identical resumes to the same employer, Jake Williams would be more likely to get a callback. The implication is that black-sounding names carry an economic penalty. Such studies are tantalizing but severely limited, for they can't explain why Deshaun didn't get the call. Was he rejected because the employer is a racist and he's convinced that Deshaun Williams is black? Or did he reject him because Deshaun sounds like someone from a low-income, low-education family? A resume is a fairly undependable set of clues. A recent study showed that more than 50% of them contain lies. So Deshaun may simply signal a disadvantaged background to an employer who believes that workers from such backgrounds are undependable.
Steven. What background is that? Exactly. What is the disadvantaged background you're talking about? Okay. Dude, that's just racism, but it's racism where you're like showing your work. He's like, it might be racism, but what if it's racism? Like, seriously though, I don't like the description of like the employer is a racist, because that makes you go like, oh, well, they're a racist. Luckily, I'm not a racist, which kind of makes you stop examining your own implicit biases. And we all have them, like, as a result of how you're socialized and stuff. And if you're like sorting people into racist and not racist, you're not examining your own actions and looking at where you could be exhibiting a bias without realizing what you've done. You might think for example, you might think you're picking up signals of a disadvantaged background and not realize that you are actually just being racist. It's just classic racist. Like, He's not offering Deshaun. He didn't reject Deshaun for the job interview because he's black. He rejected him because he thinks he comes from a background that's lazy and unreliable. Like, it's totally different, you guys. It's totally different. You can't tell, right? You can't tell if it's racist. So stupid. These are professors at the University of Chicago, everybody. The 2025 revised edition includes an excerpt from another book authored by the same pair because the nearly limitless array of subjects into which economists will butt into and make asinine proclamations about cannot be contained in just one book. So in this excerpt that they include at the end, these two dipshits relate how, despite having just published Super Freakonomics, where like people could read it, they were still invited to meet with the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, David Cameron. The UK was in the midst of a major recession and facing a growing national debt. That meant broad and deep budget cuts would need to be made. However, David Cameron then explains that there are a few things that absolutely cannot be cut, particularly the National Health Service, much to the shock and horror of our economists, who are flabbergasted that the UK, like every developed country other than the United States, considers healthcare to be a human right. You see, what the Prime Minister doesn't understand, they say, is that when healthcare is affordable, people consume it inefficiently. They go on to explain, quote, "But healthcare under a setup like the UK's is virtually the only part of the economy where someone can go out and get nearly any service they need and pay close to zero, whether the actual cost of the procedure is $100 or $100,000. Well, what's wrong with that? When people don't pay the true cost of something, they tend to consume it inefficiently. Think of the last time you sat down at an all-you-can-eat restaurant. How likely are you to eat a bit more than normal? This means the worried well crowd out the truly sick, wait times increase for everyone, and a massive share of the costs go to the final months of elderly patients' lives, often without much real advantage." Unquote. Okay. First of all, that's just not how it works. First of all, a patient cannot just decide on a whim to get a procedure that costs $100,000, okay? In a managed system like the NHS, really the only thing a patient can choose to do on their own is go to their primary care doctor, which, when it comes to medicine, is pretty much trivial in terms of the cost. The only way a patient would be able to get a procedure costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, or pounds in this case, would be if their primary care doctor referred them to a specialist who then determined that the procedure was necessary. Second of all, preventative medicine is very important for controlling medical costs. It is much cheaper for a so-called worried well person to get regular checkups to identify things like high blood pressure and prediabetes so that they can be treated early with interventions like ACE inhibitors or metformin that cost pennies per dose and prevent far more costly outcomes down the line, like needing to use a costly long-acting insulin or going to the emergency room in an ambulance due to a heart attack. The worried well getting regular checkups does not appreciably increase healthcare costs. A primary care visit or preventative prescription is not expensive. Waiting to go to the doctor until you are, quote, truly sick, unquote, can be extremely expensive. Third, In the case of the elderly patient at end of life that is getting treatment that is clearly only increasing their suffering, I highly doubt the cost of treatment is going to be what sways their decision making in a way that the suffering itself was not. And if their caregiver is the one making decisions, I can tell you from experience that cost is the last thing on your mind. And there are cases where even if hospice costs 10 times more than another treatment, you'd still choose hospice for them. I would also point out that the first modern hospice was founded in the United Kingdom, and the British palliative care system has been consistently ranked as the best in the world for decades. Ugh. But they continue, okay? Quote, "This sort of overconsumption can be more easily tolerated when healthcare is only a small part of the economy, but with healthcare costs approaching 10% of the GDP in the UK, and nearly double that in the US, you have to seriously rethink how it is provided and paid for," unquote. Yeah, clearly the NHS is just pushing healthcare costs out of control. Wait. What was that part about the American healthcare system costing double that? It would seem our $95,000 hospital bills are not so effective at reducing costs, my guys. That's because healthcare is not the same as a fast food meal. If it's going to cost you $150 to go to the doctor for a minor issue or $300 to get a diabetes medication, you just don't go. You don't fill that prescription, or you cut the pills in half to make them stretch longer, and then you go to the emergency room when the minor issue has become a major life-threatening issue that leaves you dead, or with a $75,000 hospital bill that pushes you into bankruptcy. That's one reason why the US has the highest medical expenditure in the world by far, and that buys us the worst healthcare outcomes in the world by far. Another reason is, the fact that our private insurance companies are effectively middlemen who are incentivized to collect the highest premiums possible while paying for as little healthcare as possible so that they can pocket the rest. These companies operate for profit. Think about how many executives and employers a company like United Healthcare or Aetna has. All of them collect salaries, they work in buildings that cost rent, and the company turns big profits. The way they are able to pay their executives and all their employees and all of that and make a profit is by taking in as much as they can in premiums and then using that money to pay for as little healthcare as they possibly can by cost sharing through co-insurance, co-pays, deductibles, or outright denials. They are incentivized to make as little of the money you pay for health insurance go toward healthcare as they possibly can. Incentives. I thought economists were all about incentives, yet it doesn't seem like they've taken 5 seconds to consider all the incentives involved with the US healthcare system before they, tell a country that pays half of what we pay that their system makes healthcare costs more. And the reason you haven't done that is because economics is not science. Because for something to be science, you have to approach it using the scientific method. And the scientific method would have made you stop and think about how the fact you just stated to support your argument is the complete opposite of what you would expect if your conclusions were sound. Yet that's literally the only data you provide. The rest of the support you provide for your conclusions is all-you-can-eat buffet metaphors. You can't conclude that affordable healthcare causes healthcare spending to increase based on the fact that it feels true to you that people eat more at an all-you-can-eat restaurant without providing data to justify the assumption that healthcare use and buffet food consumption are acceptably similar. But you haven't done that, okay? We humans have a propensity toward biases and making unsupported assumptions without even realizing that we're doing it. All topped off with a brain that exhibits the same response to being proven wrong as it does to physical pain, serving as a maraschino cherry on top. It's a dangerous combination, and that's precisely what the scientific method is meant to shield you from. Economists pull this shit all the fucking time, and then they claim that economics is science, and they're so objective and logical, but no, you're not. So that's why Freakonomics is a garbage book, and it seriously pisses me off how this genre just goes around with completely unearned arrogance, constantly doubling down and selling millions of copies of their books. I genuinely don't understand how they didn't feel the need to make any revisions before releasing a 20th anniversary edition. Like, how is it not humiliating to put this trash out again? Are you serious? Ugh. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I love you all. I've been Mac. Peace out. Bye!